Officer Valerie thought she was in control until the man she pushed turned out to be her new boss. But instead of fighting back, he watched and waited. Why would a police chief let injustice play out this long? If that question gives you chills like this video, share it with someone who values dignity and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories. Now let's go back to that courtroom. It was a slow, tense morning inside Ashmore County Courthouse, the kind where the air felt heavy and no one smiled too wide. Civil hearings weren't usually this crowded, but today the benches were full, neighbors, activists, even a few local reporters. All eyes were on the woman sitting calmly at the defense table, Officer Valerie Kincaid. White, blonde, decorated, accused. Across from her sat a black mother gripping a worn purse with both hands. Her son, just 14, wasn't in court today. He was still recovering from a broken wrist, a swollen eye, and bruises that stretched from his ribs down to his thigh. He'd been walking home from the gas station with a cold soda. Valerie said he tried to steal it, said he lunged at her, said she had no choice but to strike first. But the store's security footage, though conveniently incomplete, showed the boy walking out calmly. Witnesses, black neighbors, mostly said he was polite, soft-spoken, that he offered to pay, that Valerie didn't give him the chance. Judge Grayson, old and pale, sat slouched behind his bench like he'd rather be anywhere else. He had the air of a man who'd seen too many courtrooms, or maybe not enough of the right kind. He didn't look at the mother when she spoke, didn't ask Valerie a single hard question. His voice was quiet, but it cut like glass when he snapped at the plaintiff's attorney for making a scene. The mood in the room shifted when the side door creaked open. A man entered slowly, his steps unhurried as though he knew precisely where he needed to be and why. He wore a plain gray coat. His shoes were polished but quiet. He carried nothing, no briefcase, no file folder, just his presence. He didn't glance at the press or the judge or Valerie. Instead, he scanned the room, once took a seat near the back, and folded his hands in his lap. No one whispered about him. No one seemed to recognize him. But the mother did glance his way, just once, like she sensed something. Valerie, still all poise and steel, leaned into her lawyer and chuckled low enough to seem casual. Her attorney didn't smile. The court clerk announced the session back in order. The mother was called to the stand. She spoke with a trembling voice, trying not to cry. She described how her son came home that day bloodied and terrified, still clutching the crushed soda can. Said she begged him to tell her what happened, and he kept saying, "I didn't do anything, Mama. I swear I didn't." Valerie never looked up while the woman spoke. Then came the boy's pediatrician, listing the injuries in clinical terms. Nothing life-threatening but extensive trauma. Defensive wounds, swelling on the left side of his head. Judge Grayson didn't blink. Just asked how long the boy had been in physical therapy and whether he'd be missing school long-term. The man in gray didn't move, not once, but his eyes, sharp and quiet, stayed locked on Valerie the entire time. The defense called a witness, another officer who'd been on patrol that day. He testified that Valerie had radioed in a possible suspect matching the boy's description, that he arrived after the incident, that he trusted her judgment. The plaintiff's lawyer pushed gently, but the judge kept interrupting. "Move on," he barked. "This isn't a criminal case." And yet in every breath, it felt like one. Valerie took the stand last, calm as ever. She recited her diversion like she'd practiced it 100 times. The boy had acted erratically. He lunged. She feared for her safety. She did what she had to do. She smiled faintly when she said it. The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet. The mother looked down at her lap. The spectators stared ahead, their eyes a mix of disbelief and weary familiarity. Then the man in gray uncrossed his legs. It was a small movement, but it made Valerie glance toward him for the first time. Their eyes met, just for a second. She looked away. No one spoke to him. No one asked why he was there. But the way he sat, the way he watched, not out of curiosity, but with the calm certainty of someone taking notes on more than just testimony, made the air around him feel different. His name wasn't on any docket, no badge on his chest, but Miles Duvall knew this courtroom well, because starting next week, he'd be the one overseeing the entire department. And he came here today, not to intervene, not yet. He came to watch what justice looks like when it thinks no one is watching. Inside Ashmore County Courthouse, the tension didn't ease. It shifted, settled into the walls, crept between the wooden benches, coiled under every breath. No one dared raise their voice yet. Everything felt louder. The trial continued, but some battles weren't being fought on the record. Valerie Kincaid sat tall at the defense table, her shoulders sharp, her jaw set. From the outside, she looked calm, but when she leaned slightly toward Officer Ron Tully beside her, the corner of her mouth curled just enough to betray a different tone. "You see him," she whispered, not bothering to hide the disgust in her voice. "Another one of them, sitting back like he's gonna fix the world with a stare." Ron barely tilted his head. "Came in with that watchful vibe, huh?" Valerie let out a small, humorless laugh. "It's always the quiet ones think they know better than the rest of us. Like they're above it all." She kept her gaze steady ahead, but her tone turned sharper. "He'll be writing up reports by tomorrow. Probably already drafting his little statement, systemic, this inequality, that." Ron smirked but didn't reply. He'd heard this before, from her and from others. A few rows back, the wooden bench creaked gently as Miles Duvall adjusted his coat. His notebook rested quietly on his knee, open to a half-filled page. He hadn't moved much since he entered, his body language calm, but his pen, it had been moving. Not constantly, not obsessively, just enough. He wrote in short strokes, careful lines, each word measured. His eyes didn't follow the witness. They scanned the room, watching how people reacted to what was said and what was left unsaid. Next to him, a courtroom employee approached slowly. A woman in her 50s, black with pressed gray slacks and polished flats. Her badge read Anita Coleman. She held a bottle of water in one hand, hesitation in the other. She didn't say anything as she neared Miles, just offered it with a respectful nod. Before Miles could react, a white bailiff named Cooper stepped forward from the side wall, inserting himself between them with an almost effortless motion. "Sir doesn't need that right now," Cooper said softly but firmly, addressing Anita without looking at Miles. Anita blinked, still holding the bottle. She looked at Miles for permission. He met her eyes briefly, gave a faint shake of the head. She didn't push, just nodded, offered a soft, "All right," and turned back without another word. Miles's hand returned to his notebook. From behind, a whisper broke the quiet. "He's not just watching." The voice belonged to a woman seated near the rear corner. Darlene Bishop. Her eyes deep and still followed Miles the way a mother watches a child cross the street. "He's waiting," she added. The woman beside her furrowed her brow. Waiting for what? Darlene didn't blink. For this room to tell on itself. Valerie was back on the stand, her voice steady, her story unchanged. She stuck to the details word for word, like a script rehearsed for weeks. "Suspect lunged at me without provocation," she said. "I was alone and I had to make a judgment call." Her lawyer nodded along. Judge Grayson listened with the same blank face he'd worn all morning, not questioning, not doubting, just waiting for her to finish. "I feared for my safety," Valerie said again. "It wasn't about race, it was about response." She looked over at the mother, then back at the clerk. Then she paused, just slightly. She looked toward the back of the room and locked eyes with Miles, only for a second. But it was enough. Her words stalled. Her throat tightened. She recovered quickly, but the slip had happened. Miles didn't flinch, didn't frown, just stared back. Calm, knowing, unbothered. He wrote something down. Judge Grayson cleared his throat. "Continue, Officer Kincaid." Valerie snapped her eyes forward. Outside, the moment the courtroom seemed unchanged. But for those who were really watching, something had shifted. The whispering wasn't in the gallery anymore. It was in people's heads. And Miles Duvall, the man in gray, just kept listening, not to the words, but to the truth behind them. When the judge called for a recess, the air in the courtroom didn't relax. It shifted, subtle, charged. People stretched and murmured to each other, but the undercurrent of tension still pulsed. Beneath every step, every glance, Miles Duvall didn't move. He remained seated, quiet, still watching. Valerie Kincaid stepped down from the witness stand with the deliberate grace of someone who thought she was winning. Her eyes skimmed the crowd until they landed on him, unmoving in the third row, a notebook closed neatly on his lap. She walked toward him, slowly, confidently. Her badge wasn't on, but it didn't matter. She wore her authority like armor. "You think you're clever," she said softly, her lips barely parting. "Filming inside a courtroom? That's a felony, sweetheart." Miles didn't answer. His gaze didn't flinch. That silence, once dismissed as passivity, now held weight. Valerie leaned in, her voice dropping. "You all think you can sneak in here with your little civil rights agendas and make people like me look bad. But let me tell you something, this isn't your playground. It's my house." She smiled, but there was no kindness in it, just calculation. Without breaking eye contact, she slipped a small, folded paper into the inner pocket of his coat. The motion was practiced, like she'd done it before. Then she turned on her heel, striding away like nothing had happened. Two officers stood near the courtroom doors, half watching. Valerie made a slight motion with her chin. That was all it took. "Excuse me, officers," she said loud enough to catch the attention of the room. "This man's been acting suspiciously. I believe he's in possession of unauthorized recordings and possibly internal police documents." A hush fell. The taller officer, Tully, approached first. "Sir, do you mind if we check your belongings?" Miles rose slowly, calm as ever. He handed over his notebook without a word. His movements were unhurried, his eyes unreadable. The second officer, Ramirez, reached into the coat pocket and pulled out the slip of paper Valerie had planted. He unfolded it and frowned. "It's a personnel report," he said to Tully. "Looks like restricted material." Valerie crossed her arms, watching him closely. Her expression flickered with satisfaction, just barely. Tully looked at Miles. "Sir, do you want to explain how this got in your possession?" Miles didn't blink. He simply shook his head once. No confusion, no panic, just a steady refusal to play the game on her terms. Gasps murmured through the courtroom. Whispers rose behind hands. The atmosphere turned electric. Judge Grayson banged his gavel twice. "This is a civil hearing. Remove any disruptions from the room immediately." Valerie stepped slightly to the sidearms still folded. She didn't need to say more. The message was clear. She believed she'd just cornered him. But not everyone was so convinced. From the front of the room, Anita Coleman, the court clerk, narrowed her eyes. She had noticed Valerie lean in earlier just long enough to reach inside his coat. She said nothing now, but she was watching. And in the gallery, Darlene Bishop whispered again, voice low as smoke. "He's not panicking," she said to no one in particular. "He's letting her bury herself." Ramirez looked at Miles once more. "Sir." Still no answer. But this time that silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of someone who'd expected this moment and was waiting for the rest to unfold. And for the first time since the trial had begun, Valerie didn't look as sure of herself. When court resumed, the room settled into a sharp silence. Valerie sat straighter, chin lifted just enough to feign dignity. Miles remained in the third row, still and unreadable, his notebook now back in his coat pocket. Judge Grayson adjusted his robe and cleared his throat before addressing the court. "I have reviewed the motion filed by counsel for the plaintiff." He began, his tone flat, "and I see no compelling reason to delay proceedings. Motion denied." The attorney for the young boy stood trying once more. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this new incident involving Officer Kincaid planting evidence, there is no proof of that accusation," Grayson snapped. "And unless you have direct video or sworn testimony confirming it, I will consider further discussion contemptuous." The boy's mother, seated just behind the plaintiff's table, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Her eyes were red, her cheeks wet. She wasn't sobbing anymore. It was something quieter, the kind of crying that made no sound at all. Her son reached over, just a boy in a buttoned shirt too big for his shoulders, and touched her arm. "It's okay, Mama," he whispered. "We knew they wouldn't believe us." She shook her head, barely managing to speak. "You didn't do anything wrong, baby. You just wanted a soda." Grayson looked up annoyed. "Ma'am, I understand this is emotional, but I must ask you to maintain courtroom decorum." She nodded quickly and wiped her face, but didn't say another word. Neither did the boy, but the silence between them said everything. Valerie didn't look back at them. She didn't have to. Her eyes were locked with the judge's. It was brief, no more than a flicker, but it was enough. A signal passed between them like static, invisible to most, unmistakable to those who knew how to watch. Miles saw it. His expression didn't change, but one hand slipped into his coat again, brushing against the cover of the leather-bound notebook. A name was scribbled on the last page. He had written it down during the recess. Across the courtroom, the gallery watched the boy and his mother sink a little deeper into their chairs. No comfort came. No one moved to offer a hand or even a kind glance. No one except him, and still he didn't say a word. It was the defense's turn to speak again, and Valerie took the stand with confidence. Her voice rang out, clear, rehearsed, righteous. "I feared for my safety," she said. "The young man was aggressive, uncooperative, and advancing toward me with unknown intent." Her eyes swept over the courtroom and for a moment lingered on Miles. "Law enforcement officers must be trusted to act in real time. I did what was necessary." Grayson gave a small nod, not a legal endorsement, but something softer, approval maybe. No one interrupted, no one objected. The court reporter kept typing keys, tapping like distant footsteps in an empty hallway. And through it all, Miles just watched, quietly. He was the only person in that room who wasn't playing a role. He wasn't a grieving parent. He wasn't a terrified child. He wasn't a proud officer trying to clear her name. He was something else, something still unspoken. And maybe that's why people were starting to notice him more now. not because he raised his voice, but because even in silence he stood for something louder. The hallway outside the courtroom was narrow, too quiet for a space carrying so much weight. People filed past slowly, their voices, hushed shoes tapping against the polished floor. Some avoided looking at Miles as they passed. Others stole glances, quickly turning away. He stood alone near the bench against the far wall, his notebook now tucked away, his hands in his pockets. His presence was calm, unassuming, but not invisible. Valerie Kincaid stepped out a few moments later, heels clicking sharp and fast like punctuation marks on a page she believed she had written. She spotted him almost instantly. She didn't hesitate. With a low, steady tone that barely masked her scorn, she approached him. "I've seen your type before," she said. "Quiet, polite, pretending you're not part of the mess. But I know what you're doing." Miles didn't respond. His eyes stayed forward. "You people think you're rising," she whispered, close enough for her words to carry heat. "But I know what keeps you down. It's not us, it's you, always has been." Still, he said nothing. Valerie tilted her head as if studying him. "Maybe you think silence makes you noble. Maybe you think it gives you power. But let me tell you something." He turned calmly to walk away. She shoved him, hard. The force sent him stumbling sideways, his back hitting the marble wall before he slid to the floor. Gasps scattered down the hallway. A few heads turned. One woman, court visitor holding her phone low, had just tapped record moments earlier. Her camera caught the exact second of impact, the surprise in his eyes, the cold grin flickering across Valerie's face. He didn't shout. He didn't push back. Miles rose slowly, deliberately brushing the dust from his trousers. He adjusted the collar of his gray coat, straightened the crease in one sleeve, and finally looked at her. That look was not anger. It was something quieter, something older. Valerie opened her mouth as if to speak again, but her voice caught. For the first time, her confidence seemed brittle. The hallway had fallen still. Someone whispered behind them, "Did you see that?" Another voice replied. He didn't even flinch. The woman with the phone lowered it gently, her eyes wide, heart racing. She didn't know who the man was, but something about his silence unsettled her more than any outburst could have. Miles turned back toward the courtroom, walking as though nothing had happened, as though this moment, this humiliation, had already been accounted for in whatever plan he carried quietly in that coat pocket. Valerie remained where she was, lips slightly parted. She looked around and realized for the first time not everyone was pretending not to see. Some had witnessed it, and others had recorded it. But Miles, he hadn't needed an audience. He had chosen not to speak. And somehow, that silence was beginning to echo louder than her voice ever could. As the courtroom settled back into place, the defense team stood with a smirk barely concealed. "Your Honor, we respectfully move to dismiss all charges. My client, Officer Valerie Kincaid, acted within reason. The child was aggressive. There is no solid evidence of wrongdoing." Judge Grayson didn't even pretend to deliberate. He leaned forward, gavel in hand. But then came a voice. Calm, commanding, razor sharp. "Your Honor, that won't be necessary." It wasn't loud, but the entire room turned. Miles Duvall was on his feet. The quiet man in gray was now walking straight toward the bench, every step echoing with a purpose too heavy to ignore. Valerie's face drained of color. She whispered something to her colleague, but her voice caught halfway. Miles stopped in front of the judge. No hesitation, no fear. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather badge case, laid it flat on the edge of the bench. Grayson frowned, leaning in. "Miles Duvall, Chief of Police, appointed last week by the governor's office to oversee this county's internal affairs." A gasp spread through the room like wildfire. Phones dropped, hands covered mouths. In the back, a clerk accidentally knocked over a water cup. Valerie blinked twice. "Chief?" she whispered more to herself than anyone. Miles turned to face the room, not with arrogance, but with unmistakable authority. "I sat in this room and listened to lies passed off as law. I watched a courtroom twist the truth because it thought no one important was watching, but I was." He turned to Grayson, his voice cut cleaner than the gavel ever had. "You denied motions without cause. You silenced a grieving mother. You allowed a witness to be harassed outside your courtroom. And you let an officer plant evidence on me." Gasps again, murmurs now rising like thunderclouds. Miles took one deliberate step closer to the bench. "You know what the real threat is, Your Honor. It's not a boy with a soda can. It's a system so used to lying it panics when someone finally tells the truth." Valerie staggered back half a step. Her lawyer tried to object, but the words died in his throat. Judge Grayson sat frozen. His hand hovered above the gavel, now too heavy to lift. Miles scanned the room, gaze sharp. "To the citizens in this room, I wasn't here to watch. I was here to witness. And now so are you." A beat of silence. Then a voice from this gallery, trembling but clear. God bless you, Chief. Miles gave the judge one last look, firm and final. I'll be filing federal charges, effective immediately. This court is no longer under your protection. He turned, buttoned his coat, and walked back to his seat, not as a man in gray, but as the storm none of them saw coming. And for the first time that day, the gavel never came down. For a few moments after Miles Duvall revealed his title, the courtroom sat frozen in stunned silence. You could almost hear the breath catch in people's throats, the air so thick it pressed down on every shoulder in the room. Even the ticking of the courthouse clock felt too loud. Valerie stiffened. Her lips twitched into an uneasy smile. Well, she said, voice louder than it needed to be, that doesn't change the fact that this civil hearing is now adjourned. There is no standing evidence to proceed. She glanced toward Judge Grayson. He nodded just slightly, but it was there. But Miles didn't ask. He didn't wait. He walked forward calm and assured like a tide rising without warning. From the inside of his jacket, he pulled out a thin envelope and handed it to the court officer, who looked at the seal and turned pale. The Department of Justice has issued a federal mandate for an internal investigation. Miles said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet force that demanded attention. Effective immediately. A murmur rippled through the room like wind over dry leaves. Before Valerie could speak, the courtroom doors opened. A woman with a press badge around her neck stepped in, followed by two cameramen. Behind them, a man in a dark gray suit, federal credentials visible, walked swiftly to the front. Agent Shaw, Internal Affairs, he said, showing his badge to the judge. We've been following Chief Duvall's inquiry. Valerie's eyes darted between them, panic flickering beneath the surface. Then, with precise timing, one of the agents connected a laptop to the court's monitor. The screen came alive with footage from earlier that day, the hallway. Valerie's voice rang out cold and sharp. You people think you're rising, but I know what keeps you down. Then the shove. The room inhaled as one. A gasp moved like a wave. The video faded, replaced by an audio clip. It was Valerie again speaking to a fellow officer. They don't need to be provoked. Just push them a little, they show their true face. Gasps turned into murmurs of disbelief. Someone whispered, "She said that?" Miles didn't flinch. He simply opened his notebook, turned to a page, and read aloud excerpts from internal reports signed and time-stamped, showing repeated complaints against Valerie that were inconveniently dismissed by Judge Grayson's chambers. He looked directly at Grayson now. There's a difference between being a judge and being a shield for the lawless, he said. Today, that line ends here. Grayson tried to speak, but Agent Shaw stepped forward. Sir, per Section 41 of Judicial Conduct, we're placing a temporary hold on your authority pending full review. It was the first time Judge Grayson looked small. Miles turned slightly, his voice quiet now, almost too gentle to hold so much weight. I didn't come here to make noise. I came here because justice isn't supposed to be a show. It's supposed to be a standard. And then he said it slowly, as if letting the room breathe again after holding its breath all day. Justice doesn't whisper anymore. It speaks and it listens. The room didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It simply stood still, as if it knew something sacred had just been restored. The courtroom felt different that morning, heavier, as if it had finally realized the weight of its own silence. Valerie Kincaid didn't show up. Her seat sat cold and empty, and the whispers came quickly. Reporters gathered by the courthouse steps, lenses pointed, hungry for a glimpse of the woman who once walked those halls like she owned them. Now she was nowhere to be found. Judge Grayson, however, sat in his chair, lips tight, spine stiff. His gavel remained untouched, and yet everyone in that room knew he was already cornered. Miles returned, not in silence this time, but with a quiet command. Behind him walked representatives from the Department of Justice, the State Attorney General's office, and members of a federal investigation task force. It wasn't a show of power, it was the beginning of accountability. He placed a thick binder on the bench in front of Grayson. 317 pages, he said, each one a case mishandled, a voice silenced, a life altered. The judge said nothing. He didn't even look at the report. Miles turned to the courtroom. This room belongs to the people, and today they reclaim it. Applause didn't follow, not yet. People weren't ready to celebrate. They were still trying to believe it was real. A staffer approached with a document, an online petition with over 30,000 signatures from citizens of the county demanding Judge Grayson's immediate suspension. Names scrawled in digital ink. Ordinary people finally speaking. Then a familiar voice was called to the front. The mother of the 14-year-old boy, the one beaten for holding a soda can. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked, but her voice held steady. My son stopped talking after that day, she began. He stopped sleeping. He started asking why his skin made people afraid. She looked at Miles, then around the room. Today, I saw him smile again. Her words fell into the silence like a stone into water. No one dared speak. Even Grayson dropped his gaze. And then right as Miles was preparing to leave, someone burst through the courtroom doors. A marshal approached Miles and whispered into his ear. Outside, across the courthouse plaza, Valerie Kincaid was in handcuffs. She had been arrested after an anonymous tip. Video evidence, planted documents, abuse of power. It was all there. The image flashed across phones and screens like wildfire. Valerie, once smug and untouchable, now in cuffs surrounded by federal officers. Back inside, Miles paused near the back of the courtroom. A young black boy sat near the aisle, barely 12, wide-eyed, knees pressed together. Their eyes met. Miles leaned in slightly. I came to clean house, he said, and I'm not done. He straightened his coat and walked toward the exit, the crowd parting in quiet awe. By that afternoon, the photo had already gone viral. Not the one of Valerie, the other one. Miles stepping out of the courtroom, head-high coat, still gray, expression unreadable. The caption read, "He never raised his voice, but the whole system heard him." The morning after the courtroom upheaval, the story was everywhere. Cable news played the same clip on repeat. Miles Duvall, calm as stone, stepping forward, holding out his badge and saying, "I came to see justice when it thought no one was watching." The headline below read, "The silent sheriff who spoke for a generation." Social media lit up. Hashtags trended. Tweets turned into articles. Blogs turned into panels on national news. But more powerful than all that were the voices that followed. A retired teacher in Georgia posted, "For years I've taught civics. Today I finally believe in it again." A mother from Alabama wrote, "My son was arrested for skipping school. They treated him like a criminal. I watched that man stand there and say nothing and speak louder than anyone ever could." And from a small town in Mississippi, a young black boy named Khalil mailed a hand-drawn picture of Miles standing tall in front of a courthouse, shielding a child behind him. Even the news anchors seemed moved. One of them, usually dry and distant, spoke directly into the camera and said, "He never raised his voice, but he raised the standard." Still not everyone agreed. Some loud corners pushed back. Too political, they said. Too theatrical. But their words barely echoed, drowned out by the quiet strength of something real. Miles didn't go on television. He didn't sit down for interviews. But he read every letter that reached his desk. Letters from veterans, from school children, from elderly couples who thought they'd never live to see justice work like this. One letter, written in cursive and sealed in a floral envelope, simply said, "You gave us back our dignity." That afternoon, as the sun hung low behind the courthouse, the boy's mother came to see him again. No cameras, no crowd, just her. She held out her hand, voice trembling but steady. "You didn't just protect my son," she said. "You protected all of us." Miles didn't say a word, but something softened in his eyes. And then just a small, quiet smile. Not of pride, not of victory, but of understanding. That night, a vigil formed on the courthouse lawn. No protest signs, just candles. Folding chairs. Songs played low on a guitar. Little kids drew chalk outlines of Miles in his gray coat across the pavement, while old folks sat and watched. A young man whispered, "We're not just standing for justice. We're standing because someone finally stood with us." And in the upstairs window of the courthouse, Miles watched it all in silence. He didn't need to say a thing, because now the whole country was listening. The air felt different that morning, softer somehow. Miles walked down a quiet street where not long ago, fear used to sit on every porch. Now people waved, some just nodded. One little girl, barely taller than the mailbox, ran up and pressed a daisy into his hand before darting off again. He didn't say much. He never did. But every step he took said something. He passed the precinct. The flag hung still. A few officers inside glanced up, then quickly looked away. Some with shame, some with something closer to respect. A small coffee shop on the corner had its door propped open. Inside, the owner looked up from the counter, smiled wide, and pointed to a newspaper resting on the counter. There on the front page was a photo of Miles standing tall in the courtroom, the crowd behind him frozen in that moment of revelation. The headline simply read, "One man, no noise, all justice." The owner didn't speak, just slid the paper toward him and mouthed two words, "Thank you." Miles nodded, took his coffee black, sat by the window watching the sun climb through the morning fog. His phone buzzed once, a message from the Department of Justice. They wanted him in Washington, a new position, national oversight, bigger scope, Louder halls. He stared at it for a while, the screen glowing quietly in his hand. Then with a breath just deep enough to matter, he locked the phone and placed it face down. Justice didn't need a louder voice. It just needed one that didn't shake. Later that evening, he sat by his desk at home, the same worn leather notebook beside him, the same quiet lamp glow. He penned one last letter, addressed to the boy at the center of it all. Your name matters, so does your truth. You didn't have to shout to be heard, and you didn't need to win to be right. I saw you. I believed you. One day someone else will need you to do the same for them. Be ready. He folded the letter with care, slipped it into an envelope, wrote the boy's name in clean, careful print. Then as twilight settled in, Miles walked to the courthouse steps, alone. No press, no fanfare, just the whisper of wind through the trees. He stood still for a moment, the city behind him, the light behind him, his shadow falling forward across the steps. It wasn't a statue, it wasn't a headline, it wasn't a speech. It was a man who never raised his voice, but made a system listen. And then with the quiet steadiness of someone who had done exactly what he came to do, Miles Duvall walked on. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful story. What Miles Duvall showed us today isn't just about one courtroom or one act of injustice. It's about the quiet strength of dignity, the power of truth spoken without shouting, and the courage to stand firm when the system hopes you'll stay silent. This story reminds us that change doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it walks in quietly, takes a seat, and waits. And when the moment is right, it speaks not just for itself, but for all of us. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more true-hearted narratives that challenge injustice and honor the human spirit. Your support gives our creative team the strength to keep digging deeper, telling stories that matter, and giving voice to those who've been ignored for far too long. And as always, we leave you with one thought to carry forward. Justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it walks quietly and changes everything. We'll see you in the next story.